All right, I do believe that we are live. I'm just checking it, just making sure. But I do believe so. Only one more minute. The internet. Do you ever have the issue where your internet slows down when it rains?
Maybe it sometimes it's an animal of itself.
Hold on, we may not have gone. We may not be live. I'm having trouble.
Oh.
It says, give me 1 second here. Oh, we are. All right, we are live. The internet is just a little bit slow today, but we definitely are. All right, Hafade todos hamzu buenavudzo. Hafade, nanhuse Michael Bavakwa. My name is Michael Bavakwa. Zengwawi host Midzo Tatlu Paresti Fanachu, and I am your host once again for Fanachu. And so, for today's episode, we are focusing on the National Historic Preservation Act. I have with me author, veteran, historic preservation advocate, cultural preservation advocate, Dave Lotz, who will be talking with us today. He'll be presenting. And so let's just, let's jump into this. One of the important things about historic preservation, understanding these laws, is that these laws are all connected to everything from the military buildup to private development. These historic preservation laws are essential in terms of maintaining our connection to the past, ensuring that sort of destruction of things which might be precious or important to future or current generations take place. And so I don't want to say too much about it because Dave has a lot to share with us, but I want to remind everyone that you can comment, you can message me questions that you might have, you can comment with them on the Facebook Live. But yes, Dave, let's hand it off to you. Thank you for joining us on Fanachu.
Well, thank you. I just want to mention very briefly some of my background so people can understand. I've been a resident of Guam, came here in the Navy in 1970. I've been associated with historic preservation, not continuously, but various roles depending on where I was employed. But I actually started the National Historic Preservation Program on Guam with the Department of Parks and Recreation in 1974. So I've got a little bit of continuity in this and can lend some perspective to it. But let's go right to the slides.
All right, Dave. So whenever you're ready, go ahead.
Well, thank you. We're going to discuss the National Historic Preservation Act, which is it's over 50 years old. This is a federal act of the United States. It's become the dominant or most likely used piece of federal legislation dealing with historic preservation. There has been laws before and after this that in some ways change this or act independently of the National Historic Preservation Act. I'm just going to give some highlights of what my perception is of what is important on Guam. There are books you can buy about this. You can search the internet, and there are other aspects that we just don't have the time to discuss today. Let's continue on. Going ahead to the next slide. Obviously, like federal laws, there's always a purpose to the law. And here it's stated, it shall be the policy of the federal government in cooperation with other nations and in partnerships with the states, local governments, Indian tribes, Native Hawaiian organizations, and private organizations and individuals to preserve our heritage through a variety of methods. Now, that's a good, noble purpose, and that obviously by itself doesn't come anywhere near making this a priority, because all sorts of federal agencies have their own priorities. The interesting thing about this statement is you probably will note what is omitted, and that is indigenous peoples of the United States that just don't happen to be organized as Indian tribes or Native Hawaiian organizations. Let's continue. There are multiple components of the National Historic Preservation Act. I've outlined here in blue the ones that we're going to be going through today. And as you can see going through this list, there's a whole lot of other aspects that can be covered. In this regard, Guam and the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands are considered for purposes of this law as a state. And then we'll talk about the National Register, State Historic Preservation Officers, and federal actions under Section 106. Go ahead and continue. First of all, let's take a look at the National Register of Historic Places, because the ability to be listed on the National Register or eligible for the National Register involves meeting a criteria. And the vast majority of the National Register is based upon these type of properties meeting the criteria. What are we talking about properties? The buildings, such as the Convento and Maleso, the districts, such as all of the heart of Old Inaran Village, objects, such as shipwrecks. Let's continue, look at some more of these types of properties. Sites, probably the most prevalent is Laddystone sites, and even though I think in looking at our pre-contact discoveries, there's probably a little bit too much of a focus on just the laddie, and it misses the rest of the cultural landscape. And of course, that skips to going down to the lower right-hand corner. But structures is an obvious example of properties for the register. Toliacho, the one in Agana, is here. And then the two at the bottom interest me much more, and they're a newer concept than from 1966. Traditional cultural properties. And I've got a photo here of a carabao just grazing in a beautiful valley inland in Iran. This is a traditional use of this land on Guam, and therefore that should be a traditional cultural property. You could certainly say the same for traditional fishing areas and gathering of medicinal plants. And perhaps you could certainly make the point about Fua Rock and what's associated with that. And then the other one that I've alluded to from the sites is a cultural landscape, taking a broader look at our cultural resources and looking at it as a landscape, instead of just saying isolated laddie sites are eligible. In this beautiful area of Mepo, and I know some of you have been there, Mageta's been there with me, you can barely see a laddie in this photo, more towards the right side. But when you look at the total natural landscape, the hills and valleys, it's dotted with laddie. That is a great example of a cultural landscape. Shall we continue? And then we can get to a long discussion of the National Register of Historic Places criteria for evaluation. I've highlighted the words that appear to be pertinent in these explanations, and these come right out of the requirements that are used administratively for the National Register, and it can get quite wordy. Quality of significance in American history, architecture, archaeology, engineering, and culture is present in district sites, buildings, structures, and objects that possess integrity of location, design, setting, material, workmanship, feeling, and association. All of these words, basically, you can go to the web, to the National Park Service Cultural Resources, and give you a lengthy explanation on these. And then the second one, that are associated with events that have made a significant contribution to the broad patterns of history, that are associated with lives of significant persons, that embody the distinctive characteristics of a type, period, or method of construction, or that represent the work of a master. And then the bottom one, likely to yield information relative to history or prehistory. Shall we continue? Now I want to focus on responsibilities. One of the important responsibilities is vested in an individual that is called the State Historic Preservation Officer. These are appointed by the governors of states and territories. There is some qualifications of this that they have to. Many states, and including Guam, have passed legislation that put parameters on the type of individual that shall be appointed. Responsibilities of the SHPO, we don't spell it out, we just, the good old acronym of SHPO, responsible for receiving grants for historic preservation, administrating a public historic plan and program, conducting a statewide survey. They're responsible for going out and actually locating sites. Now, I know a lot of this is done by, say, third-party entities such as private contractors or other federal agencies, but this is supposed to be accomplished by the SHPO's office. And consult with federal agencies, including Section 106 review. One of the important things that we need to recognize, and too often is not recognized, because unfortunately we don't have as assertive people in our government that we should. This National Historic Preservation Act is one of the few acts that puts us on an equal level with the federal agencies, and we need to understand that. And the last one, and you'll find this other places, the SHPO is responsible for public participation. That's right embedded in the National Historic Preservation Act. Let's continue. Now, Section 106, a very simple statement in the law. This Section 106 of the law is, federal agencies shall take into account the effect of their undertaking on historic properties. The Advisory Council of Historic Preservation was also created by this law and responsible for issuing, promulgating, and monitoring the regulations to establish a good procedure for the 106 process. One thing I do want to mention is this is procedural. Procedural meaning the federal government, the federal agency, is responsible legally to follow the procedure. This is not substantive. Substantive is thou shalt not. And there's the separate federal law, Archaeology Resources Protection Act, that says you shall not take a historic object from a historic site's a property of the federal government. Just like there's a law that says you cannot capture or kill an endangered species. You can go to jail for that. So this is procedural. Certainly, federal agencies have been held responsible for failure to follow the procedure. What I have at the bottom is two photos before and after of Magua site at Sinicales. Unfortunately, the procedure was followed. Guam due to an agreement that I'll get to in a minute, followed it and actually agreed to this destruction. Continue, please. Now, participants in the 106 process. Federal agencies, the Advisory Council I briefly mentioned, the State Historic Preservation Officer. I'm plugging in tribes and Native Hawaiian organizations because I feel we need to make an effort with our delegate in Congress to get an entity, perhaps undefined at this time, for the peoples of the Mariana Islands, Chamorros, and up in the Commonwealth, Carolinians to have a voice. Local governments, the applicants for federal assistance, and again, the public should be involved. Continue. Now, what is an undertaking? This is a key point, because this triggers 106 by a federal agency. Undertaking means a project, activity, or program funded whole or in part under the direct or indirect jurisdiction of a federal agency, including those carried out by or on behalf of a federal agency, those carried out with federal financial assistance, and those requiring a federal permit, license, or approval. Let's go on to some examples to drive this home. Projects, and we're looking at three aspects in this photo. The upper left-hand corner is direct federal construction, such as the Marine Corps base. Financial assistance, low-income housing that is constructed by Guam Housing and Urban Renewal Authority, but is paid for by the federal government. Second aspect, that's financial assistance. And then we have a picture of a crane at Apra Harbor doing some dredging for the port. That requires a federal permit, and therefore that triggers Section 106. Now remember, 106 only involves federal actions. If there's an action that is done strictly privately or by local government of Guam, resources, the local laws would apply, but not this. Continue. And of course, we're looking at activities now. Perhaps one of the most featured activities would be military training and its impact on cultural resources. Continue. And then programs. Now, I strictly want to say this is a hypothetical example, so please don't be misled. But this is where the federal government provides assistance for a locally run program, and it might or might not have impacts on cultural resources. So say a federally funded activity uses a historic structure, in this case, the old Inaran Community Center. That should be run through a 106 process, because you never know what innocently might be done to improve the program, but could impact the structure of the historic building. Somebody might have a legitimate idea of modernizing the inside. Well, that would be 106. Again, hypothetical. Continue, please. Now you can go to Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, and there's a good flow chart. There's also a lot of additional information. We've already touched the introduction, talking initiation, and the next step is identifying historic properties. Continue. We need to move on here. Well, this is the key, because you're talking about where is the federal action going to be. You have to identify historic properties, determine the area of potential effect, review existing information. You need to go, though, out of the office and talk to people and actually look at the area to seek information to identify these properties. And then you have to evaluate the historical significance to see if it's eligible for the National Register. Now, there can be two results. One, no historic properties affected. The parties agree, and that completes the process. The second is historic properties affected. That results in a further review. Continuing on in the process, then you have to assess the effects and achieve a resolution. And let's go on to the next slide, please. Assessing effects. And in order to do that, you have to see if there's an adverse effect. Examples are physical destruction, alteration of the property, removal from the historic location, change of the property's setting, introduction of visual, atmospheric, and audible effects, simply neglect if the property is abandoned, or a transfer. If there's federal property that's going to be disposed of, real estate by the federal government, that transfer has to go through 106 and conceivably could have an adverse effect unless measures are taken to ensure the property and its character is preserved. So going on to the next slide. Now, resolution of adverse effects, and this is the section that can get very complicated and detailed. And it's important that getting to this step, the first three steps are followed. Agency officials shall provide an opportunity for members of the public to express their views on resolving adverse effects of the undertaking. The agency officials shall use appropriate mechanisms taking into account the magnitude of the undertaking and the nature of its effects upon historic properties, the likely effects of historic properties, and the relationship of the federal involvement to the undertaking to ensure that the public views are considered in the consultation. The agency officials shall also consider the extent of notice and information concerning historic preservation issues afforded the public at earlier steps in the 106 process to determine the appropriate level of public involvement when resolving adverse effects so that the standards are met. Now, in putting these slides together, this is a good example. This is a direct verbatim quote from the regulation. I have removed, for ease of simplicity, the actual citation, but they are available. Continue. And of course, there's always a failure to resolve adverse effects. There's no agreement made. Termination can be made. Again, this is a procedure that can be followed. The agency shall notify parties, and then, of course, they have to make final decisions on this and notify the advisory council. So the process can be resolved without an agreement. Again, this is a procedural. Continuing. And there are alternate program alternatives for this. You can use alternate procedures, programmatic agreements, exempted categories, and standard treatments. Again, there's a wealth of information on this. This is just a concise overview of what should be done. So we continue. And then we need to look into programmatic agreements because they tend to be what Guam has got itself into relative to the military. You negotiate a programmatic agreement when the effects on historic properties are similar and repetitive, when effects cannot be fully determined, that's a real risk, when non-federal parties are delegated major decision-making, routine management or circumstances warrant, consultations with SHPO and other parties, and the agency shall arrange for public participation. And again, a programmatic agreement is not mandatory, but it is a viable component for resolution. Continuing on. Now, I'm going to end this with just some critiques of what we had as a purported resolution to military actions. One is the Mariana Islands Testing and Training Programmatic Agreement, signed off December of last year. And I've been quite critical of this because the undertaking may potentially affect historic properties. That was a statement by that there was 247 properties covered by this programmatic agreement by the acting Guam SHPO, but those properties were never revealed to the public that should be a participant in this. The other is their process went 3 steps, omitted the 3 steps that should be mandatory. Being in on some of this, the Navy just presented a programmatic agreement, and unfortunately our politicians are not assertive, and they just were looking at that and should have insisted upon the 3 steps that I've outlined. Describe the undertaking, describe historic properties affected and assess adverse effects. And then incredibly enough, what little too late requests for comments were made by the Guam SHPO, and that's a responsibility of the federal agency. In this case, it's the Navy. Now let's move on. So clearly, public engagement was inadequate, lacked any meaningful review of cultural resources, not held in a forum for discussion, and just too late. There's no provision for Guam SHPO for oversight and monitoring the training. The public is excluded from MIT programmatic agreement functions, and vague terms are used with no definition of best management practices and cultural sensitivity training, lacking any sensitive definition and scope. I will say, I wrote a piece earlier, probably over a year ago, that said that Guam just basically abdicated its responsibilities under this. Now, I did, purely by chance, see on the military channel a video that they're running that is labeled cultural sensitivity, that I can only speculate is there to satisfy this requirement. It is kind of one of those feel-good videos to describe the Chamorro culture on Guam. In that aspect, it's credible, but it doesn't even get close to the issue of problems that have arose on Guam with the military dominance here. And it doesn't even mention the fact that cultural objects should not be removed from sight. So there's serious efforts that are lacking in that. Moving on. And then the one that's 2011, the military buildup. Guam came away from that not very good. Incredibly, when that was signed by the SHPO, it sanctioned the destruction of Magua Village at Nick Cam. Now, it did provide $14 million for the funding of a repository to the government of Guam, who inherited an obligation for curation of the artifacts. That's under construction now at the University of Guam. The problem is that it takes a responsibility from the federal government and places that on the government of Guam to in perpetuity fund the curation of the artifacts. And to me, even further, it sends a signal that Guam is fine accepting the artifacts and the destruction of the sites that the artifacts are from. And then a public access program in this that is controlled by the military that is just simply not working because of the bureaucracy of the security forces at Naval Base Guam got a hold of this and made it not workable. And then even now, the COVID has put a suspension on this legally required program. But at the same time, we see Navy MWR conducting tours, hikes to Guam boonie stops off the base to historic sites such as Hilan and Seja Bay. So they can come outside the base to look at our cultural resources, but we can't go on the base to look at those. That just isn't right. Let's continue. Very briefly, 4 aspects of preserving historic properties that are clearly identified that should be the basis for a good historic preservation program. Preservation, rehabilitation, restoration, and reconstruction. Basic standards for treatment. Continue. What I want to state is what you see, particularly at Magua, this is not historic preservation. Salvage archaeology and recordation and artifact removal to a repository, that's just not historic preservation. And I know there's going to be archaeology reports written, but then of course I have not to know where there's a library where those are readily available. But the point is, this type of treatment is not historic preservation. Continue. So what are the recommendations? We need 106 training, not just for the people involved, but for the people that are like listening to this. This hopefully gives you an incentive to go to the Advisory Council of Historic Preservation webpage and see what more you can learn. The public needs to be involved. After all, these are agencies working under a law, a federal law, that is supposed to preserve our cultural resources. Public needs to be involved. We need to be assertive. Do not be trapped by a federal agency. And when people, agencies or individuals or organizations go into a meeting, be organized. Get organized before the meeting so that you do not show up ignorant as to what you want to do. Have a plan. And keep in mind, this is negotiation. You're not dealing with federal agencies like you want them to vote for you at the next election. You want to have some serious negotiation because you're dealing with our cultural resources.
I like that one. That's a good point.
We seem to lose our perspective, and we need to be assertive. And I think too often we frankly have a colonial mentality that we have to be subservient. And to reiterate, this is one of the few federal laws that gives the people of Guam an equal status. Continue. Well, I think I've run out of too many words, and I know I flew through a heck of a lot, and there's a lot more information on 106 and National Historic Preservation Act. Now, are you going to leave this on the screen so people can jot down to do follow-ups at their convenience?
I'll leave it. I'll leave it up, and what I'll also do is I'll put it into the comments on the video too, so people can also email you there.
And now this will,
yes,
this will
but
be.
then I'm gonna. If you want, I can leave it up.
It's really up to you how you run the program, but this will be available. This program's available on Facebook, right?
Yes. And
Okay.
I'll upload it to YouTube as well, so people can watch it on YouTube.
Well, I appreciate that. So
yes, so we have first of all, I wanted to thank you for just reminding that even though there's a lot of ways that Guam doesn't have a lot of power in certain equations, especially with the federal government, there are certain parts of the buildup and around historic preservation where Guam does potentially have more power if sort of it's utilized. And so thank you for reminding us about that in your presentation.
well, you're welcome, Michael. And I know I went through an awful lot. Do you have some comments or questions coming in?
Oh yes, we do. We have some questions coming in. Some of them are focused more on your presentation, others on other things. But first, I wanted to get this one out of the way. Somebody wants to know where they can buy a copy of your hiking book.
Faith Bookstore, Jeff's Pirates Cove, bestseller, Warner Pacific Visitor Center, Navy Exchange. There may be some more, but those come to mind.
Yes, and if you aren't familiar with Dave Lotz's book, a new edition has come out more recently, sort of an updated edition published by UOG Press. And so I'll actually put into the comments as well a link to that if you want to get a copy of it online.
The title is The Best Tracks on Guam, and an awful lot of those hikes go to our cultural resources. So I invite people to visit places like Pagat, Seja Bay, Ilan, and get an appreciation of what is worth us protecting.
No, thank you for that, Sedusmasi. And so here we have a question from somebody who you just brought up Pagat, and this person would like to know a little bit more about that. So I think this person is familiar with sort of the fact that about a decade ago, the US military wanted to use Pagat. And so this person is asking, though, did the government of Guam or did different community groups use the process that you're talking about to protect Pagat, or they want to know what was used to protect Pagat?
Pagat was proposed to be included into the Marbo/Andy South area for part of the Marine Corps training, and the firing ranges would extend over Pagat, and therefore they would be closed to the public. At that time, the governor of Guam's office, this was the second Camacho administration, actually volunteered to give this land to the military. Again, we're not posturing ourselves to negotiate. When there's an opportunity, and the buildup gave a splendid opportunity that was missed by our politicians to get what we really needed from the military. The illusion of economic benefits really isn't there. Pagat got into focus because the military had requirements under National Historic Preservation Act. At the same time, they were running public forums under the National Environmental Policy Act. And I can remember meetings in Diridu and Jigo when people were rather upset when they began, when the word got out of Pagat was being threatened. Already in those days, people were visiting it and gaining an appreciation for the site. And then there was enough concern expressed, enough collectively people doing things together. We Are Guam was formed and became a focal point. And then federal officials, some of them relatively high ranking, came out. I believe one of them was the administrative head of the Council for Environmental Quality. And we had a tour. I organized a tour of these federal officials so they got a firsthand experience of the Pagat environment. And when they came out at the end of the tour to where they were to be meet their transportation under Route 15, there was several hundred Chamorros and their fellow friends demonstrating along the road. So the process envisioned in 106 in National Environmental Policy Act was being followed. This became known to the public, and it generated further concern and had a snowballing effect that resulted in public protests that did have an impact on the process. I really wish we would have had the same earlier on relative to Litejan, but it seemed to me people, the unfortunate thing is the military then quickly moved on to Litejan and more or less preempted the opportunity. So the thing is, we have to be eternally vigilant and think that if you win one battle, you've won them all. You haven't.
very good reminder. Thank you for that. That the for some of these fights, people in the community take it up. Um, but for the military, there are people whose their full-time jobs are to kind of push ahead with projects like this. You
So
know, and so
that's the unfortunate aspect. Military's got people in good paying jobs to make certain they follow the law. Their job in historic preservation, is primary focus is to make certain the law is followed. That's not the same of preserving the cultural resources. Government of Guam, by primarily financial restrictions, and I would also say by political priorities that change, is not as flexible or as mission oriented, which leaves it to the people.
yes, again, it definitely does. So we have some questions coming in, but first I wanted to give some people had some feedback for you. For example, Franklin Mundo says, "Thank you, Mr. Dave Lotz, for advocating for our culture, our heritage and culture." Hey, former Congressman Robert Underwood says, "Biba Dave Lotz." Dorothy Nauta Fegeger says, "Hafade from Tacoma, Washington." Elissa Santos, Biba Dave. We've got a lot of positive comments, and then we do have some questions. So let me ask one of them. We have from Raymond Kidagwa. He would like to know, do you think that the federal government would trade Pagan for Tinian? Do you feel that and Sinod, if you could also clarify your question, do you mean, because I think that the military wants both of those in different ways
Well, first of
for
all,
different types of training.
I do want to thank the people listening in, and they're my friends, for those nice comments. Thank you so much. I tend to think the military, they look at this as long term. They will grab what they can and then get the rest later. So it's kind of like letting the camel let his head in the tent door, and the next thing you know, the whole camel's in the tent. So be careful of how this is done. My own opinion is the military should not have Pagan and should do nothing more on Tinian. But Michael, this points out another thing. The different perspective in the Commonwealth, because they have the covenant, because they were able to deal with the United States from the standpoint of sovereignty. The thing that we need on Guam, we need to have the people on Guam, particularly the Chamorros, to assert the fact that their sovereignty has never been relinquished.
Now, thank you for that reminder. I think it is, and I think for everyone watching, it's important to remember that the military, you know, thinks about these issues in a very different way, with a wider strategic focus, a longer term focus in some instances. Whereas for many of the community groups, even if they're in it for the long haul, it is sort of from fight to fight, from issue to issue.
But
And
this also shows how these issues are interrelated.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think one thing that we've seen, for example, is that after there was a lot of public outcry over Paget, then the military sort of shifted its plans, and suddenly there were all these new plans in the CNMI. And I think part of that may have been in response to how, if people in Guam are going to push back against this, well, then maybe the people in the CNMI won't. And I think they've been surprised a little bit at how much there's also organized resistance in the CNMI as well.
Well, there's a danger there that I think we need to, in some way, institutionalize relationships with the Commonwealth, because you're alluding to, and I don't disagree, federal government could play off one against the other.
Very true. Very true. And so, Raymond Kidagwa, he's clarified. So he's saying so that Tinian, I believe, Senor, you're saying that by trading one for the other, then Pagan could become sort of a next. You said the next Silicon Valley. Interesting. I mean, that is one of the things that in the CNMI they have more ability over in order to sort of look at that, to look at those sorts of negotiations.
But I tend to think if he's suggesting Pagancy to be the location of a computer industry, you've got to look at the logistics of Pagan. I was fortunate to have one trip on Pagan, and I'd like to go back again. There is really no infrastructure. I'm glad to see that there's efforts to have homesteading up there. But I really think the people of the Ghani need to make their own decisions and how the best use of Pagan and the Ghani will be towards the lifestyle that they choose. Before we went on the air, Maget and I were talking about how we're mostly trapped in an American economy that has taught us there are things that we look at as necessities that are really not. So I would be very concerned to have more biting into being dependent on an American economy. Again, other issues that are related. We need to look at some real self-sufficiency and not just more industries that are dependent on outside economics.
I'm sorry, he's clarifying. He says Tinian to be the next Silicon Valley.
Oh, well, then
that would be
mistaken.
But yeah, thank you for your comment, though. That's something definitely to consider, because economic diversifying in the islands is definitely needed. I think the pandemic has shown us that.
But
let me move on to
diversity tied in with more self-sufficiency. But that's up to people.
Definitely. So let me move on to the next question. Rick Guerrero, who says that he just picked up a copy of your book on Amazon right now during this episode. He says, doesn't it seem that the process that you were talking about earlier is just a formality, and if the military wants something bad enough, they have a way of convincing the incumbent administration to acquiesce to their desires?
He is very, very correct as far as the pragmatic truth of this. And again, this process is procedural, not substantive. But I think it comes to something else I made a point of rather recently. We need to have staff or elected officials that are very versed in military capabilities, weapons, and so on in the legislature and the governor's office, so they can ask critical, incisive questions and not just accept what the military says they need. I've been very critical that the Marine Corps base on Guam is not even necessary for the defense of the United States. The next war is going to be at air and sea. These are Marines on the ground. The Marine Corps base was justified under one reason: quicker response time to potential trouble spots in Asia by air or sea. That's true. But the air and sea transportation, amphibious warfare, and cargo ships, they're not here. So it's a moot point. So we need to be critical and analyze the truth of this. We just cannot accept the military says they need something. Well, do they really need it?
No, thank you. I think a lot of people, including many of our political leaders, economic leaders, and even your average people, didn't quite understand that part. And I think part of this may deal, and you are a veteran, you served, you've been around the federal government for a while. On Guam, your average person feels that sort of the military has this high luster. Like the military really knows how to get things done. They're amazing at doing all this stuff, that they're efficient. That's one thing that always kind of weirds me out, is when you look at the US military, you see efficiency in some ways, but you see so much waste. You see sort of pork barrel politics at play. You see a lot of backroom billion-dollar deals for defense contractors. And so I think you mentioning there the fact that the military argues we need a place for these Marines, right? So we're going to put them in Guam, but then it's an incomplete strategic equation, because they're still stuck, as you mentioned, waiting here for all of the things that the military doesn't want to put here. And so as you said, you have to be more astute and kind of think through these things to realize that, you know, the military has their own interests, their own sort of things that they're factoring into this. And as much as they might talk about the strategic importance of this or that, it's not necessarily, there's not necessarily the most efficient thing at stuff like this.
Very true.
And so I wish more people would kind of understand that. But I found that for a lot of, you know, people who have been in the military, they think, oh, the military gets things done, this and that. And it's kind of like, the military is also a very large, overbloated thing. You know, around the world, if you think about how much of the US budget annually goes to the military. You think about how much went into Afghanistan.
Well, and it has problems with its size. The U.S. Navy lost an aircraft carrier due to a fire at a pier in San Diego. Written off several $1 billion or $1 million worth of a ship due to either ineptness or sabotage. They have an internal problem. And I think they need to look at these instead of just, we have a Congress who throws money at the military. And of course, many of these congressmen are funded by a military industrial complex. And that's a whole other issue of what keeps the system going. Are there more questions?
Oh, there are definitely more questions. And so we have another question here. So if you were, so this person is familiar with your criticism of the SHPO, the office of the SHPO. And so they would like to know sort of if you could improve this process, like right now, what would your first steps be to kind of improve the process? You mentioned the SHPO, Guam's participation in these things. So what would be your first steps to improve this process so Guam could have a better position?
SHPO's office, totally transparent, reaching out to the public as much as they could with an understanding that the SHPO is to protect our cultural resources because they work for the public. And I could go further to say, working with the public, we need to have a clear cooperative arrangement and good sound policies so the people of Guam understand how projects are reviewed and what the criteria is. We don't have that.
It's no, it's true. On Guam, we seem to be very well versed in the perks of the military, but then your average person doesn't seem to have as well of a knowledge about some of the drawbacks or the problems with the military, right? But we have another question that just came in. And so what, if any, can the delegate of Guam, Michael Sinicales, assist our people in the historic preservation of our culture or our cultural sites?
I'm trying to think of the correct term, but Delegate Sinicales is pushing a bill in the Congress to have a study of our cultural resources on the island. I think that's a good option, and I'm drawing a blank as the exact term is being used. But anyways, I think if you're interested in what he's doing, get a hold of his office and express the support for that.
No, and I think so one thing that is missing in this equation, and it was also missing under the previous delegate too, is that the current delegate, Mike Sinicales, doesn't serve in the Armed Forces Committee. So he serves on the, and so because of that, he's not sort of directly tied into a lot of these discussions at the federal level that his predecessors were. Although, as we know, Madeline Bordallo would sometimes not be as transparent as she could have been about a lot of these issues. But one thing that we're missing now is that link into the sort of the federal decision-making process on some of these things.
Yeah, I see it as kind of a mixed bag. Unfortunately, Madeline Bordallo also lost some opportunities by being on that committee. But what I see of Michael Sinicales, he has decided to be on more of a finance committee. And I think we're seeing some benefits in permanentizing and increased funding in other financial programs that assist individuals on Guam. Basically, in the Congress, you can't be on every committee, so you have to make some choices. With his financial background, I think he feels that's important. But of course, then there's drawbacks to what you very specifically mentioned. You're not getting into the committees that deal with military policy.
Yeah, that's why when Robert Underwood ran against Mike Sinicales last year, he said if you were on that committee, then you could put in specific things into like the defense spending bill. You know, you'd have greater ability to put in things such as environmental requirements or funding requirements for certain things. But then, as you said, the current delegate sort of doesn't see that as being his role.
Yeah, and I agree with Robert Underwood that you needed somebody that's assertive in those areas that you've just mentioned. Previous delegate was not as we would perceive that there was opportunities there.
And so one last question before we have to end. So do you feel that the fight to save Latexan or save Tinian has already failed? Or do you think that there's hope? So
I think we're going to have to say there's always hope. You know what's interesting, and you can see this in countries around the world and in the United States, all of a sudden, either due to politics or budgets or military priorities, Department of Defense all of a sudden decides they don't need to be someplace. I mean, look at the tragedy of Afghanistan. All of a sudden, the United States says we don't need to be there. I mean, it's probably a well-founded decision, but it's the most pertinent example today where Department of Defense, backed by the president and probably most of the government, decides we've abandoned billions of dollars in equipment and bases we've built. So I think someday we have to look realistically that the military is going to decide they don't need parts of Guam. They actually did that in the 90s. They gave up Naval Air Station. They gave up Ship Repair Facility. They gave up Naval Facility Guam for technology reasons and strategic reasons. They gave these up. This will happen in the future. Now, the problem is going to be, do we end up with a viable entity that will come back to the people of Guam? Is it something that's going to be inherently useful? If you look at like agricultural use, there's many places that they've turned back that is topsoil was scraped, that has concrete pads on it. It's too bad we couldn't have a mechanism where you will restore it to its original condition.
No, and so it was good that you brought that up, that there's the land can be given back, but there's certain things that can be done to the land which will limit how much we can learn from it or how valuable it is, even if it is returned.
I mean, ironically, the military is putting a lot of money as mitigating measures to enhance the limestone forest, which is a subject of its own, but that's behind the fence. Where's the area where it would enhance the limestone forest so our cultural practitioners can use the resources, where people can go out and get an appreciation for the forest?
Oh, very good point. Very good point. And so I wanted to remind everybody that if you wanted to get a copy of Dave's presentation, you can email him or you can call him here. He's also on Facebook as Dave Lotz. And I'll put this presentation on YouTube for people who don't use Facebook so that they can still view it. And yeah, just remember, as Dave said, there's always hope. And that sometimes hope will, sometimes hope in this equation isn't, as you said, it may not be the most hopeful thing, right? But we do understand because sometimes the possibilities here come about because of decisions made that we don't have anything to do with, but we can still benefit from them, right? So that's something to always think about, is so long as Guam is considered to be strategically valuable in one way, it may inhibit our abilities to develop in other ways. And so, but yes, the most important thing I think that we can get from Dave's presentation today is just that reminder that we live on a very militarized island. And so just as much as we may know the cost of gas on base, we should also know the cost of the bases to the island in terms of our cultural resources, our environment, and so on. We have to be educated, not just about the benefits and the perks, but also the negative costs, the negative impacts. And we need to elevate ourselves, educate ourselves in that manner. And so, Dave, I wanted to say Sidus Mase and thank you so much for joining me today. This was a really good overview. This was a really good overview of National Historic Preservation Act, Section 106, the role of the SHPO. And so thank you again for joining us on Fanachu.
Well, thank you for having me.
All right. Adios todos hamzo. Adios esteki manat lihital.